Thank you for joining us online tonight for our program. I'm Adriana Farmiga, Associate Dean of the School of Art at the Cooper Union and a proud Ukrainian. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land of the Lenape people upon which the Cooper Union stands today. For those of you who may be new to Cooper Union, a brief intro. Cooper Union is a private college in New York City with distinguished schools of art, architecture, and engineering, and concentrated study in the humanities and social sciences. For more than 160 years, as part of our legacy of bringing free public programs to New Yorkers and now virtually to the world, Cooper has hosted a variety of voices in activism, education, culture, and so much more. Our program this evening is an example of that legacy at work. I'm honored to introduce tonight's panel discussion on the life and work of artist, author, educator, and organizer Faith Ringgold, who is one of the most influential cultural figures of her generation, one who links the multidisciplinary practices of the Harlem Renaissance to the political art of young Black artists working today. Tonight's program title, On Faith, Harlem, points both toward Faith Ringgold's enduring impact as well as the importance of Harlem and particular values in her work. Just like Harlem artist, educator, and activist Augusta Savage, who was born more than a generation before Ringgold and who we are proud to say is a Cooper Union alumna, Faith Ringgold uses her practice to amplify the voices of Black Americans and the ongoing struggle for social justice and equity. When Ringgold was just 9, Augusta Savage became the only Black artist invited to exhibit at the 1939 New York City World's Fair with a sculpture that depicted a chorus of Black figures united in song. That piece was destroyed following the World's Fair since there was no funding to store it or cast it in bronze. The conversation that Savage helped spark was picked up and brought further by artists like Ringgold. Through work that spans mediums from murals to quilts to performance, Ringgold critiques American injustices and challenges racial and gender inequalities, and we are grateful for it. I would like to take this time to thank our partners for tonight's program, the New Museum of Contemporary Art, just down the road from Cooper, and Phaidon Press, which helped gather this remarkable group of writers, curators, and artists. On Faith, Harlem is presented in conjunction with the opening of Faith Ringgold, American People at the New Museum of Contemporary Art. It is the most comprehensive exhibition to date of Ringgold's groundbreaking vision, and it is accompanied by a fully illustrated exhibition catalog co-published with Phaidon that focuses on all aspects of Ringgold's career. And if you missed our opening slides, Phaidon is offering a 20% discount. You can see those details on our website. Thank you again for joining us. Before we get started, please note that closed captioning is available at the bottom of your screen. Now I will turn it over to Andrew Westover, who is the Keith Haring Director of Education and Public Engagement at the New Museum. In addition to their work at the New Museum, Andrew teaches at the City University of New York and is a PhD candidate in education and ethics at Harvard University. Previously, they have held posts at the J. Paul Getty Museum, Herscher Museum and Sculpture Garden, and the Phoenix Art Museum. Welcome, Andrew.
Adriana, thank you so much for that generous introduction. Really appreciate all of you joining us today. As Adriana mentioned, I am Andrew. I'm the Keith Haring Director at the New Museum for Education and Public Engagement, and I also join you from the unceded land of Lenape people. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying respect to Lenape people, elders and ancestors, past, present, and future. I'll not review again the panel itself because I know we're ready and raring to go. I will, though, say that Faith Ringgold American People is now open at the New Museum, and we would love to have you come and see the exhibition. It's at our site on Bowery. The exhibition was co-curated by Massimiliano Gioni, Ed Lisneeson, Artistic Director, and Gary Carrion-Murayari, Kraus Family Curator. We are lucky to have Gary joining us tonight as the moderator for this conversation, which will feature panelists Rob Fields, Sandra Jackson-Dumont, Sharifa Rhodes-Pitts, and Nari Ward. Programs like this are core to the museum's work, and I'd like to thank some of the people who brought this together. Again, thanks to Kim Newman and the team at Cooper Union, as well as Siobhan Bent, Alex Kumbis, and the team at Phaidon Press for their support. I'd also particularly like to thank Education and Public Engagement staff members Andrea Caldries and Derek Wright, and the entire New Museum team for their help bringing this together. New Museum public programs are generously supported by the Bowery Council, and digital initiatives are supported by Hermione and David B. Heller. We also thank our members, supporters, and friends, like you, who help make these programs possible. Now I'll share brief biographical notes about each of tonight's panelists. Rob Fields is an arts leader based in New York City. He is the recently appointed director of the Sugar Hill Children's Museum of Art and Storytelling and the former president and executive director of the Weeksville Heritage Center in Brooklyn. Over the course of his career, he's been a marketer for major brands, cultural institutions, and indie artists, a cultural programmer, and the publisher of an online magazine for over a decade. His writing has appeared in Hyperallergic, Forbes.com, and Huffington Post. Rob is a graduate of Carnegie Mellon University. Sandra Jackson-Dumont is a curator, author, educator, and administrator who lives and works in Los Angeles. Jackson-Dumont is the director and chief executive officer of the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art, a new museum under construction in Los Angeles. Throughout her roles with some of the country's most renowned museums, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Seattle Art Museum, and now the Lucas Museum, she has collaborated extensively with living artists, communities, creatives, and historical materials. Her work catalyzes the presence of increasingly dynamic and diverse peoples in cultural spaces while exploring timely issues of relevance and concern. She believes that storytelling can foster greater understanding of our nuanced humanity. Jackson-Dumont holds a BA in art history from Sonoma State University and an MA in art history from Howard University. Sharifa Rhodes-Pitts is an author and professor working in Brooklyn, New York. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, Chimurenga, Phaidon, A Public Space, Creative Time Reports, Harper's, Essence, and Vogue, among many others. Rhodes-Pitts is the author of Harlem is Nowhere, A Journey to the Mecca of Black America, a New York Times notable book of 2011 and a National Book Critics Circle finalist. Her 2015 book for young readers, Jake Makes a World, Jacob Lawrence, a young artist in Harlem, commissioned by MoMA and illustrated by Christopher Myers, was named by Booklist among the year's top books about art for children. She has received grants and awards from Creative Capital, the Whiting Foundation, the Rona Jaffe Foundation, and the Lannan Foundation. Rhodes-Pitts organizes public programs through the Freed Women's Bureau, gathering collaborators across the fields of visual art, music, theater, film, and education to produce events at venues like Harlem Stage, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the New Museum, PS1 MoMA, and Sidewalks in Harlem. She received a BA from Harvard College. Nari Ward is an artist and professor who lives and works in New York. Ward is known for his sculptural installations composed of discarded material found and collected in his neighborhood. His practice recontextualizes these found objects in thought-provoking juxtapositions that create complex, metaphorical meanings to confront social and political issues surrounding race, poverty, and consumer culture. Select solo exhibitions of Ward's work have been organized at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver, the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston, the New Museum of Contemporary Art, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, and Socrates Sculpture Park in New York. Select group exhibitions featuring his work include Grief and Grievance at the New Museum, The Dirty South, Contemporary Art, Material Culture, and the Sonic Impulse at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, Inalienable at the Contemporary Dayton in Ohio. Ward has received numerous honors and distinctions, including the Fellowship Award from United States Artists, the Viltech Award in Fine Arts, the Rome Prize from the American Academy of Rome. Nari Ward received a BA from the City University of New York, Hunter College, and an MFA from the City University of New York, Brooklyn College. And now, a few small logistical notes. This program will last for approximately 1 hour. If you would like to ask a question, feel free to use the Q&A function at any time by clicking the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. If there's time, our speakers will answer questions throughout or at the end of the program. Finally, I encourage you to learn more about upcoming public programs on our website, newmuseum.org. And now I turn the conversation over to tonight's moderator, Kraus Family Curator, Gary Carrion-Murayari.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight. I won't dwell too much more on introductions, but just to say we're really thrilled to have these incredible panelists to kick off our programming around the Faith Ringgold show. For those of you who've seen the show or those of you who just know Faith's work in general, there's so much, her achievement is so monumental that it cannot really be contained in a single program, and we have some also incredible programs that Andrew and his team have organized that will follow this. I also, of course, encourage you to come down and see the exhibition in person, and also check out the book from Phaidon, which I think also speaks to some of the things we'll be talking to tonight, but also takes it in even further direction. So maybe just to get things underway, we will start just a couple more images of the book here, but I think it's best to start with some art. As Andrew mentioned, tonight we're going to be focusing on Faith's engagement with Harlem, which is one of the most kind of longest and kind of important, let's say, relationships in her life. This is really kind of a homecoming for Faith, and her work has been seen in the last couple of years in London, in Washington, D.C., but this is really the largest presentation of her work to date. And it continues a long history that she has with the New Museum as well. With the last major museum that took place in New York was an exhibition called Dancing at the Louvre, which took place in 1998, which focused on her French collection quilts, which you can see on the fourth floor of the museum. And she's participated in kind of significant group shows there over the years, including the Decade Show, including shows on craft and art. And so, it was a kind of a logical place for her to be showing. But prior to that, the last kind of major retrospective of her work took place, really a mid-career survey that took place at the Studio Museum in 1984. So, as much as she is a kind of New York icon, her work has been sorely underrepresented by the institutions in New York. But going back to Harlem, Faith was born in Harlem in 1930 at Harlem Hospital. She grew up for the first 9 years of her life on 146th Street. At the age of 9, she moved to 363 Edgecombe Avenue. So, her childhood, intersects with, significant events that happened through the history of New York and the history of Harlem. She's an alumni of City College. She taught at public schools in the Bronx and in Harlem. And until the early 90s, that she maintained her home and her studio there. So, she is really kind of living part of the history of the neighborhood. And I think, hopefully what we'll find tonight is the way that her work continues to resonate with the art and the culture and the stories that kind of emerge from the neighborhood. So I'm actually going to start with this work here, Echoes of Harlem, which is from 1980. It's the first quilt that Faith makes. It's a collaboration with her mother, who was a fashion designer in Harlem. It speaks to, I think, the larger, kind of social and creative history of the neighborhood. And it kind of follows, in some sense, the kind of let's say the kind of like sort of open kind of embrace of the kind of the color of the neighborhood, the people, in a kind of more, let's say, universal sort of way. If you look at her paintings from the 1960s that follow, an inspiration from African textiles, paintings like U.S. America Black and Party Time, she's gathering together, faces of people from the neighborhood, people that she would have known in her daily life to kind of capture the kind of the wide spectrum of professions, of emotions, of lives that are lived all around her every day. I think so. Since we're starting with art, and I want to start maybe with an artist, Nari, if you want to come in to the chat at the moment, part of what I think Faith's work, the story that Faith's work tells, is a kind of a larger history of Harlem. That is never really, it's never really fixed. It's constantly evolving and changing and moving. And, Nari, as I mentioned, Faith lived and worked in Harlem, from 1930 until actually 1992 when she moved to New Jersey. And 1992, I think, is a significant date because it's also like, kind of the beginning moments of Nari, your, career in Harlem. And I think, as those of you who saw Nari's show at the New Museum a few years ago, we really kind of tried to cite that show and cite, a lot of your production as emerging from, your engagement with like the realities of Harlem at that particular historical moment. Maybe just to start, if you could tell us a little bit about, your first engagement with Faith and her work, and maybe what it meant to move to a neighborhood, where she really was a kind of like, let's say, iconic figure at that moment when you're just a young artist starting out.
Yeah. Hey, great. Yeah, Gary, you can hear me. Yeah. So I mean, there's a little bit of a backstory to this as well, because when I moved to Harlem, like you said, I was quite young, and I actually moved to Edgecombe Avenue, which is right 150. I think we should also back up, because I wanted to just sort of designate what is Harlem in terms of geographic, because it's changed, right? And my understanding, I think maybe other people might have a different iteration of where that the locale is. But it used to be, when I came into Harlem, it was from 96th Street, pretty much up to 100 and high 50s, 150s, you know, and on the west side, primarily, probably closer to maybe like Fifth Avenue going west. So, and that's changed, and a lot of different pressures have changed that. But that said, my uncle used to be a super in this one building, quite a historic building called 409 Edgecombe, very, very important historic building. And he was super. And I remember faith was really important, very early on, very important to me as a young artist, because even before I even knew her work, because my uncle, he was kind of the patriarch, and he brought all his sisters, my mom, you know, brother, helped us to come to the United States from Jamaica. And he even was able to sort of put us, at least my two aunts, into Edgecombe Avenue, into 409. And he kind of looked over us. And when he found that I wanted to be an artist, it was kind of like, you know, I was a failure. You know, like I was giving up, you know, I wasn't taking advantage of the opportunity to come to the US. So there was always this very strange reaction to the notion of being an artist and being an immigrant and being expected to do better than the generation before. And artist wasn't necessarily the profession you'd go into. But he, by chance, was able to, and it just so happened, Faith, and I guess maybe it was her ex-husband now, lived in 409 Edgecombe. So he got to know them a little. And I think the fact that he finally got a chance to meet an artist that wasn't crazy and was respectable in the neighborhood and in the community, and this, you know, elegant and distinguished as Faith was, I think it made it easier for him to slowly accept the notion that maybe I could be an artist, you know. And that was really interesting, because that was my introduction to who this person was. And she was always this mysterious shadow. I never got a chance to meet her. She was coming and going. But I remember seeing her work primarily in books, seeing it in museums, you know, the Studio Museum work, and primarily the quilt. And it wasn't until very recently, actually just yesterday, when I went to see a new museum, that I got to understand the range of her practice. And that just blew me away. The show is amazing, by the way. So I really was excited to be able to share my experience of Harlem and talk a little bit about faith in this panel.
Well, thank you, Nari. You know, I think one of the interesting things that I find about, you know, your work too is that I think that you know, you are also very dependent upon, you know, the lives of people around you in Harlem. And I think that's one of the great things that Faith work does is, you know, she's capturing stories of her neighbors, of friends, of family. And I think, you know, although your work is very rarely, you know, representational of individuals, like the objects that you're doing have ties to lives that have, have ties to lives of people who've touched those objects or used those objects. You know, can you maybe talk about a little bit about how you felt about, you know, like I know where you live in Harlem and where your studio's been for many, many years is not too far away from where Faith was, you know, grew up as a small child. Can you talk a little bit about what the neighborhood felt like a little bit, at that moment when you moved in in the early 90s?
I could actually say that I probably wouldn't be an artist, visual artist in the way that I am now if it wasn't for having moved to Harlem, because when I was going in grad school, my indoctrination into the arts was primarily at that time was more abstraction. It was more talk. I was actually I was majoring in drawing, and my MFA was in drawing. And I moved into a building in Harlem on 116th Street at the time. And I started collecting things in the street because I think there were a lot of things, and this is early 90s. So there were a lot of stories that I felt weren't being told. And these objects were calling me to engage with them. And so it became more about trying to find a way to talk first about bringing in a community, right? Like, who was my community? Who did I want to talk to? And I really wanted to talk to the everyday individual, not somebody who was really that indoctrinated into the art practice. And so I started with the found object, the recognizable object, as a place of common history and experience. And then the challenge, of course, was then how to make it special, how to anoint it in some way to become meaningful and maybe poetic. And I think that the storytelling component is what I really connect with when I think about Faith's work. And literally, she's telling the story, but she's also bringing us into her world. It's world making, right? And I think
that's a great way. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Gary.
I think that's a great. I think that's a great way to capture it. I mean, she's making a world, and I think the real innovation, I think for her, that I think comes through the show is this idea of the quilt as a storytelling vehicle. We're showing kind of an image of one of the early story quilts from 1985 called Street Story Quilt, which basically is a story of an entire building, and the building in the quilt is actually 222 West 146th Street, which was the building that she grew up in those early years. I might actually want to turn the conversation to Sharifa now, because I think this is a work. Generally, I think obviously storytelling and writing is an important part of kind of a key part of Faith's practice, especially in the way that she's combining, narratives of the neighborhood, her own personal narratives, and kind of larger musings on, social and, political changes she's experiencing over a period of time into these narratives of the quilt. And especially in this quilt, I thought about your writing and, in your book in particular, in this quilt, because of how tied it is to how dependent it is upon the stories of neighbors and people that you encounter on the street. I was wondering if you had thoughts on Faith's, work as a writer, and this kind of collapsing of personal and kind of historical narrative into single stories that she kind of attempts and kind of experiments with over the course of her quilt making. Oop, I think you're muted. Sorry. There you go.
Thank you, Gary, and everyone. It's wonderful to be here. I can't wait to see the work in person and be immersed in this world and this work across so many years. I was reminded that I probably first encountered Faith Ringgold's work in a book on the coffee table of my mother's collection of art books. My mother is a visual artist, and I grew up in Houston, Texas, as part of a community of Black artists. And in that way, I really resonate with something that's always been important to me when I've read and encountered Faith Ringgold talking about her work and her formation as an artist, which is the part of it that's intergenerational, that's dependent not only on the artist making herself in the world, but the artist being in relationship with others, the artist being made by the people who brought her up, and also the generations that came after with her daughters. And so that always seems to be part of the bigger story, the very important story of Faith Ringgold's work, and not just bringing forth a body of work, but bringing forth, as you mentioned, a community, making communities possible. And I love this work, and I can't wait to be able to see it close up and read the story. The important part of a story quilt, as much as the images, is the narrative. But this particular image showing one location across, as a sort of triptych across time, as a history painting, really, we can think of it as, right? This movement that we have a different experience of the place because of the color, because of the events. And, as someone that came to Harlem first through books, then through living at a very different point in its history, a good 10 years after the time that Nari spoken about, I had this experience of looking at locations that were in front of me, seeing their pictures in archives, living on the block next to the block of Romare Bearden. And so this kind of palimpsest experience of a place across time has always been really important to me. And that was always also facilitated by relationships. where I could talk to my neighbors about what that place had been before. I had an old neighbor, Miss Bessie, who used to tell me every address that she lived since she first arrived from North Carolina as a young woman. But something else I was thinking about in terms of the location or the centrality of Harlem to the work isn't so much geographical or even something we can see, but I was, reading and thinking about all the times and places that Faith Ringgold was told she could not enter, from City College art department to the Spiral Collective, to the galleries on 57th Street, to the Whitney Museum, it repeats and repeats. And this is something that we think of kind of in broad strokes in terms of the discrimination that people experience and do experience because of their identities. But when I think of the centrality of Harlem to Faith Ringgold's work, it's the persistence, the ability to persist in the face of all of those supposedly closed doors, and to make entrances and to enter and to claim the center. I think Harlem shows up because of that, the possibility of Harlem already being a center of a world, which shows up in how Faith Ringgold has moved through the world and brought her art to us.
I think that's a really beautiful way of putting it. And I should say, I know it's like, it is a little bit torturous to like look at this incredible quilt and not be able to read the story, I think. And, I should say that, the beautiful thing about this quilt, it is a story of essentially a family, 3 generations of a family over time who, have tragedy and ambition and eventually success and triumph, and how that kind of intersects with the history of a building. And I think that, persistence and Faith's own persistence, I think, is woven through all of her work. But also, I think you kind of beautifully, thinking about like, the sort of like chance locations and what they mean to, how you tell your story, I think is really important, I think, in Faith's work too. And I think I should point anybody who hasn't read Sharifa's book, Harlem is Nowhere, I really recommend it. You speak quite beautifully about your neighbors and how, like, the stories you maybe would tell would be different if you lived on another street. And also, thinking about your, writing about those photographs by Aaron Siskind of these facades that are boarded up and the stories that maybe, could have been told or have not yet been told in those buildings, I think is really important. But I think maybe since you brought it up, I think maybe it's a good time to maybe talk to Sandra. I think, one thing I think that Sharifa mentioned is, the kind of persistence in space for Faith for making spaces for her own work. And, I think the time that she emerged in Harlem, essentially, she's already a kind of well-established artist by the time the Studio Museum opened. So the institutions that she's really responding to are the ones that are like, geographically close to Faith, but essentially closed off. So, in 1970, she leads one of the first protests against the New York Museum against the Whitney for doing a show of art of the 1930s, not including any Black artists. So no Jacob Lawrence, no Aaron Douglas, no Charles White, none of these really, now canonical figures that you can't imagine telling that story without. At the same time, again, in the, late 1960s, early 1970s, she's very much aware, although not necessarily one of the organizers of kind of the backlash to the Met for their show Harlem on My Mind, a show that, kind of proclaimed to tell the story of Harlem without actually having, involvement by some of the key cultural stakeholders in the neighborhood. What you see over time is essentially, Faith making a space for herself by adapting her work and making it, let's say portable. The quilt making device is a way for her to get her work out in the world more frequently, by also seeking audiences in educational settings. She becomes both a public school teacher, but then, makes a career by lecturing at colleges and teaching at colleges. Now, decades on from that, we sort of take it for granted that institutions will show the work of Black artists and collect the work of Black artists, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's still, hospitable spaces for those artists and for, in many cases, their intended audiences. Sandra, as somebody who's worked at many of these institutions, and I think, during your time in New York, at least, I think made some really remarkable efforts to kind of change the way that museums tell the stories of the artists that they show, and also, find possibilities for people to kind of, to get something from institutions or to, have an experience with institutions that's meaningful. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about how you see the legacy of Faith, her work in Harlem and how that maybe those institutions can maybe tell those stories more effectively today.
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, respect to everyone that's here, but I also want to say that I speak to you from South Los Angeles, California, the unceded territory of the Tongva people and many indigenous folks that have been connected to this land, and I'm grateful for their stewardship over many generations, and I'm really proud to be bound up with them in being caretakers. I would say that I think it's interesting. I feel like every institution I've ever worked at has had some relationship, and Faith Ringgold has, with the exception of one, walked through the door when I was there and done something. And I would say that that speaks to her real interest in having narrative, no pun intended, like building a narrative art museum that everyone asks, what is narrative? And I'm just like, wow, go look at Faith Ringgold's work, look at Cole Scott's work, look at Carrie James Marshall, look at all these artists. And I don't think it's a mistake that a lot of the work that she has done is really putting at the forefront the stories and narratives that are both constructed and also those that are real and or imagined of Black folks. And placing us central to a lot of these spaces. In Harlem, I guess your question is also about how, and I'll speak about Harlem in a second, but your question is also about like how, and how, what are the ways in which, you know, someone like Faith finds herself in the canon of art history in many ways, right? I think one of the ways is that she is doing what a lot of artists have done, which is come through the teaching space in order to actually reform the way people are teaching and seeing in cultural institutions. So Faith, we had a children's book festival at the Studio Museum in Harlem, and we asked all these incredible artists to come who made children's books. And one of the things that Faith did was she would show up and she would read to young people. And so they were building their own book collections by building their own visual art collections because these were the artists they were admiring. People like her and Benny Andrews, like I would run behind them because Benny Andrews would do drawings of the kids, like helping them learn how to draw in a little drawing class. And I'd run behind them and say, oh my goodness, you should keep that. Like, remember to keep that to the parents. Or Faith would come over and she would like literally sit next to a kid and put her arm around the child and just sit there and talk to them and make art right beside them. So the museum becomes a studio space, if you will, for someone like Faith Ringgold. The other thing is that I think she has been, when I think about her, I don't just think about her as an artist. I think about her as a scholar. I think about how she used her own resources. A lot of people don't know this. Like, she has a fellowship or a scholarship program where she funds the writing of monographic chapters about Black artists. And she does it by having these garden parties. And then when I think about Faith and her presence in Harlem, I think about her taking Harlem elsewhere. When I think about her, Tar Beach, you know, I mean, talk about the Black imagination, you know, like, you know, she takes like a real act, like sitting on top of a building in Harlem. And this kid imagines all of these spaces that she can travel, Cassie, you know. Or I also think about Faith and how, for me, one of the most amazing things that I feel like I've learned in coming to work in museums is that she actually illustrates in her work how to behave badly in museums, how to actually participate in the transformation of museums just through your own behavior. You don't have to be quiet, you can dance, you can do, and it sounds like a little gesture, but it's actually a lot of what I've built my career on. You know, the public programs and the exhibitions and things like that that I've worked on are really tied to behaving how you would behave at home, how you would behave out somewhere else that you really enjoy, and bringing that into the cultural spaces. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think that what she's doing is bringing the lives that people live into these spaces in ways that also are pretty, I don't know, I think they are at once joyful, radical, and pointed. And then the final thing I would say is that I love the fact when I look at pictures of Faith Ringgold protesting, like there's a great picture of her and Michelle Wallace as a young girl out in front, like wearing a sign, like really, wow. But when you see, you can look at another picture of Benny Andrews too, the one who organized all those artists, like with a sign, and there's a kid next to him. And so they thought about how they brought an intergenerational approach to this work. And so I think that's why her presence is staying across generations. It wasn't just meant for her peers and her contemporaries inside and outside. It was meant for many generations to hold it. So hopefully, I don't know if I'm answering your question, Gary.
No, that's beautiful. That was perfect. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I think that like all of that activity, I think, you know, it's, I think for many people invisible, all those things that Faith has done. You know, I think you see the objects or maybe recharge, but you have no idea like how long and how hard she worked to do all those little things. And, you know, there's some wonderful stories about her, you know, being a public school teacher, you know, in the mid 1960s and, you know, bringing Norman Lewis into the classroom, you know, for an arts festival or, you know, bringing these, you know, bringing musicians and, you know, like, and famous figures because they're part of the neighborhood. And like, you know, to give access to history and creativity on that level is something that, you know, just sort of the openness and the democratic nature of that is very, very unique to Faith, I think, amongst almost any artist I can think of. So I have a picture of Tar Beach right now, which I think obviously, you know, we have to talk about Tar Beach because I think it's so much of, you know, it's an incredible quilt. It's also, you know, surprisingly in the collection of the Guggenheim for many years, which I think is also like, you know, we've looked at the Street Story quilt, which is in the collection of the Met, and it was brought in by Lowry Stokes Sims, like a, you know, legendary curator, a friend to many of us on this panel. But, you know, I think, you know, a quilt like this is, I think, one of the, you know, the great New York artworks that exists in the city. And of course, the children's book became a real sensation. You know, I think we have in our catalog, for this exhibition, we have texts by artists in the show, by Jordan Castile and Diedrich Brackens and Chabalala Self. And, you know, Chabalala's from Harlem, but Diedrich's from Texas and Jordan's from Denver. And they all, you know, their imagination of Harlem was shaped by Tar Beach, which I think is really an incredible thing, that it's both about, you know, living in Harlem and imagining and elsewhere, imagining all these possibilities, but also turning Harlem into a mythic space, which I think is really important. That's, you know, that's a process that's still happening in 1988, which I think is, you know, we kind of tend to think of like the past experiences of Harlem, but the fact that, you know, that myth is still being written at that time. I wanted to maybe bring up Rob in now, if you're there, Rob, and, you know, the Sugar Hill Museum, you know, is an institution that, you know, is very much connected to its surroundings and to the community, and to the possibilities of storytelling for, you know, for bringing individuals and a young generation into contact with creativity. You know, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about like the impact that you think Faith has had on your institution. There was actually a really beautiful show that I saw there, I don't know now, must have been at least 3 years ago now. It was, you know, pre-COVID, that showed the illustrations from a lot of Faith's children's books and also some of her really wonderful sculptures, which I think I have an image of, maybe one of right here, from her Harlem series. You know, these individuals, portraits she was making of people in the neighborhood. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that connection as you see it.
Certainly. And again, as Sandra and the other panelists said, I want to just shout out everyone here and thank you guys for this opportunity to talk about Faith and what we're doing here at the museum. The museum is very much deeply inspired by Faith Ringgold and the example she set. It is inspired by this belief that storytelling is not just the book. It is not just oral, but it also very much involves music and puppetry and costumes, all the things that made up Faith's work. And you know, one of the, you know, the thing that Sandra was mentioning in terms of her history and experience as a teacher, but also as a student, you know, when we look back on her time at City College and being encouraged by her professor to trust her instincts, she took that whole approach with her students in terms of how she encourages them. And that has certainly influenced the way that we are building our programs and our experiences around this idea that, you know, children are natural storytellers, children are innately intelligent, and that we are not predetermining their destination with their creative activities, but we provide materials, we provide the inspiration for them to do their own explorations. And that was very much in keeping with Faith's approach to storytelling, to education. And then lo and behold, one of our board members, Steve Seidel, who's, you know, a noted education scholar, says, oh, that's this thing called Reggio Emilia, this whole educational framework. But Faith was doing it for a long time, and probably developing it at the same time where an ocean away, you know, Malaguzzi was developing this Reggio Emilia approach. So, you know, this value of encouraging exploration and not predetermining a destination is so very important, particularly, I think, in Harlem and for Black and Brown children in general, whose lives can in many ways seem so prescripted and narrowed, just in terms of societal expectations. What Faith brings to her work, what we try to be about is an expansiveness, and that is certainly inspired by, you know, Faith and her curiosity, her intellectuality, and we want to bring that to the children and the families who come here to the museum, you know, to, you know, be exposed to wonderful contemporary art by people who are related to, have been influenced by Harlem, West Harlem and Washington Heights, and can use that work as a jumping off point for them to explore and begin to create and know that their creativity and their creative instincts are valid. And they can also be in a situation where they're not just creating solo, but they are doing it, you know, with their parents and caregivers and aunts and uncles, and they're learning that collaboration is one of the keys to great citizenship. And so I think that is certainly one of the big things that we take from Faith, and this inspiration in her example.
Thank you, Rob. So you can see I've moved on a little bit just to show a few of the other works in the show. You know, one of the kind of great, most kind of ambitious storytelling series after the Street Story Quilt is The Bitter Nest, which is from 1988. It's a 5-part series of quilts. You know, again, you know, these quilts are quite remarkable because they're also, you know, a way of, you know, Faith kind of working out her own kind of family, you know, family issues that all families have between, you know, mothers and children and things like that, but through the lens of like an experience of Harlem. And, you know, she kind of transports her own relationship with Michelle back to the Harlem Renaissance era. And I think that's really, you know, a remarkable thing to be able to kind of project yourself back in time and to, you know, imagine, you know, by, you know, essentially in Faith thinks, you know, she probably, you know, did have some interaction with some of the figures who appear in her work eventually, but, you know, also like, you know, creating kind of impossible dialogues with people between times, which I think is one of the kind of very special things about her work, is, you know, the kind of imaginary around Harlem that she creates. So I wanted to ask, you know, either, you know, both Nari and maybe also Sharifa too, you know, how, let's say, face a kind of creative, like, imagination around, let's say, the Harlem Renaissance. This is a piece called The Harlem Renaissance Party. And in this particular quilt, the mother, you know, who is essentially Faith, dressed in this costume, is embarrassing her daughter seated there at these dinner parties where you have people like Alan Locke, and you have, you know, Count Cully, and you have, you know, Zora Neale Hurston, you know, as these dinner guests, you know, who are willing to listen to her own stories, you know. So maybe we'll start with Nari. Like, you know, what do you think about, you know, as a young artist living in Harlem, and now I'm sure you as a professor at, you know, Hunter work with artists, you know, local young artists too, you know, about let's say the lineage of thinkers in your neighborhood. Like, how do you kind of encounter and position yourself, and how do you kind of both like kind of come to terms with the legacy that you're starting out in, and then let's say move forward to something else. Faith leads a long legacy, I think, for a lot of artists, with all that she's accomplished.
I think Gary, the thing about what's Harlem for me, even as a young artist coming to Harlem, it was always about the Harlem Renaissance. It was always about that history, and that haunting history in a way, that I grew up around, even in the time of the sort of crack epidemic of the 90s. I think that the strong sense of history that was so pervasive was really what guided and inspired one to sort of think beyond the immediate moment. And I feel like I see that in the way. There's a couple of different things that I really reacted to in an exciting way when I got a chance to be in front of all of Faith's work. Was she was telling stories about history and about personage and these individuals in their neighborhood, everyday individuals, but she was also amplifying a physicality of material. It's sort of essential. It's kind of almost a sonic methodology she was bringing in, and raising that material up to the same level as the storytelling. And I feel like that is something that I kept seeing so much in the work, that made you want to stay in front of it, and sort of brought you, sort of made it real in a way. It's almost like this her trying to almost to bring in, evolve some other kind of time relationship to these stories. So I kind of feel like that was her use of patterning, her use of the material, her use of the anecdote, or rather, her storytelling regarding her notes. I felt all of that was like music. It was what I mean by that is like there were all these different notes that were in some kind of syncopation, in common syncopation, but also sort of against each other in a really intriguing way.
I think that's great. Maybe Sharifa, to rephrase the question a little bit for you, like, I think one thing that comes through in Faith's work, and also I think just reading about her life, and also, Nari, of course we've known each other for a long time, like, talking about your life, the proximity to history and like the kind of heaviness of those legacies that I think are concentrated in Harlem, like in very few other places in New York, I think. I think that's something that comes through in Faith's work a lot. I mean, I wonder if you have anything, let's say think about that weight of history, concentrated in Harlem, and maybe how Faith navigates it, or sometimes, even, like putting yourself at a dinner party with these figures is a pretty like, an amazing and a quite bold kind of move to make, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's a matter of tradition, and in the sense of the word, that isn't just about doing what came before you, but to use this word relationship again, being in relationship with what has come before you. And you talk about the heaviness, and I'm thinking of a kind of lightness, because I'm thinking about the beautiful mosaic in 125th Street. I don't know if you have a slide of that, but
I do, yeah.
As I was thinking about this event, I realized that I haven't ever stood in that station and not studied this mosaic, because it's so captivating. It's so, and I don't live in Harlem anymore, or in the city anymore, but just like this was such an anchor for me, that I could stop and look at the Schomburg and look at the people flying by and look at Garvey flying, like this artwork. And if any people who are in the audience haven't had the chance to go and stand in front of these mosaics, I implore you to do so. Something about the experience of it's a familiarity I would agree with the term haunting, but also just a proximity to these figures, and to be with them in flight is a great invitation that she gives us with this artwork. And I love it so much. And I love thinking about all the times I stopped when I could have just been looking at the train tracks, but I could study this and be transported by it.
Yeah, no, I think the proximity thing is so amazing. I think even, Nari, you talk about your uncle, being a super at 409, and, Faith talks about, they took over Dinah Washington's apartment, and that was like the last person who lived there before. But, the proximity is so amazing. And I think it may be one of the things that makes it such a special place for her and her work, and allows her to kind of, dream of these impossible things, which become, reality for her in many ways. Like, to have those kind of dialogues, it comes from that proximity to history. The
other thing that's really great is looking at these figures flying, is very rarely do any of the figures belong. They don't get trapped in their spaces. They always seem to be momentarily there. And I feel like, as opposed to narrating a scene, right? Like, even when she's going back and looking at the European paintings, she uses humor to break you out of that moment, right? You're always being pulled in and out of the frame. And I feel like that's what she's always calling us outside of the frame. Like, she's her methodology of life is sort of revolved outside of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too that, like Sharifa was saying, rather than a heaviness, we have to remember that she was born, the Harlem Renaissance is kind of over by 1935-ish, but like a sonic boom, the boom comes after the plane is passed. And so she's still living in this place that has this memory of people like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong and Paul Robeson and Countee Cullen, and just the richness of the environment is another thing that I think lends itself to her expansiveness in her work, and that community that we've talked about earlier is really the buffer against the racism and sexism that she experiences, and yet she is able to, this anyone can fly kind of mentality that she has is so liberating and uplifting that, we just stopped to think about that she was born a month after Sonny Rollins, and they were like, they're friends. That is crazy to me that, she's friends with the saxophone colossus. These were her peers, all these great people in Harlem, and she was inspired by them. So I don't want to look at it as a kind of the weight of history, but, it's kind of like, in many ways, it's like Dawoud Bey says, when you engage in an art, you are part of a long conversation with everyone who's done it before. And I think that's what Faith Ringgold extends and brings us all in conversation with.
I had to bring up, because you brought it up, Sunny's quilt, which is the quilt here on the left. And, as you mentioned, she was childhood friends with Sonny Rollins, and has maintained the friendship over the years. This is one of my favorite quilts of hers. It's an image of Sonny Rollins practicing on the Manhattan Bridge, something we all know about Sonny Rollins. But this is also it's a great reflection on Joseph Stella's, Brooklyn Bridge painting from the 1930s. So she, even when, the work seems like intimate and kind of effortless, it's like such an intelligent and just brilliant, it's just kind of a reflection, but more than a reflection, just a kind of play with history in a really beautiful kind of way. And I think you even see that, going on and on in her work. Maybe if I'm going to sketch forward a little bit here. So I just wanted to bring also, this is the French collection. And Sandra, you were talking about, the sense of kind of misbehaving in the museum that Faith brings. Dancing at the Louvre is the quilt here on the left. And I think if there's anywhere where, anything that she necessarily grapples with in her work, because it's not necessarily that she grapples with the legacy of the Harlem Renaissance in the work explicitly, it happens more, once she leaves Harlem. So, this is, all the French collection starts, let's say, the year before she leaves Harlem, and then she kind of finishes it when she's out in New Jersey, although she's been maintained a studio in the city after that. It's when she's kind of, looking at the legacy of European modernism and, this, which is a much weightier history that she didn't necessarily, have access to, or, she was able to see those works, but finding her place in it. And actually, much of how I think we rethink about this work is due to, I think, this series and how she's, questioned, the role of her, of Black models in works by Picasso and Matisse, the kinds of work that are appropriate for her to, a Black woman artist to be making. Like that's a big theme that runs through the show, like, dialogues that are art historical dialogues that we're still having today. I was wondering, if, how you've approached, working in an institution like the Met, and obviously, the institutions you work at are very different, but the Met is, looms very large because of that history. Have you seen the possibilities for engaging that work, change, not necessarily directly because of Faith, but maybe because of the questions that she started asking?
I think the tail end of what you just said, like what she started asking, is a key part of it. I mean, we see incredible scholarship about some of the things she was just telling us to look at early on. Honestly, like their entire exhibition is dedicated to the Black female nude inspiring and being the muse for Picasso and otherwise now, whereas that wasn't something that was being talked about. And so I think that's one thing. I do see museums shifting and changing for a host of reasons. I was just at the Frieze Art Fair here in Los Angeles 2 weeks ago, and it was mind-blowing to see how much textile work and ceramics work is like now like becoming so preeminent and prominent in the art world. It's like, and at the time she was criticized for it, right? And so now it's become something that is such an important part of like laying your hands on something in a moment in where things are being mass produced. So I think that's something and so that has kind of become interestingly a part of the normalization of certain kinds of materials in museums and certain topics as well. I do think that what her work calls for is what I think post-George Floyd has called for, which is a skill set for cultural workers to be able to have both pleasant and difficult conversations about race and class. And I think that oftentimes what we've seen in cultural institutions is the inability to do that. The ability, we can have conversations about shape, line, and form, and we can have conversations about different topics, even topics around rape, et cetera. But when it comes to race and class, we seem to be very ill-equipped to have those kinds of discussions in a critical fashion, because they just make some people very uncomfortable in their own skin. And Faith is doing that through this beautiful, kind of almost joyful, imaginative mechanism. And then the last thing I would say is, while you all were talking earlier about flying, and that's the part I love so much about Faith's work, is that levity that is spiritual and it's deep. It's just not sweet. You know what I mean? It's really has multiple layers to it. It's like calling upon Black religiosity in so many ways. It's Yoruba, Santeria, Candomblé. It's all of that, all kind of being bound up in these bodies that allow you to move. But one of my favorite thing about her work, and I think we're talking a lot about the quilts, is that it's normalizing this kind of being. It's normalizing the notion of flying. It's normalizing, like, even those paintings of like, there's blood splashing everywhere, but it's like normalizing and I don't mean kind of like normalizing it so it's just easy to look at. It's an attempt to normalize discussion about these issues. And I think that her work actually is standing the test of time in ways that a lot of work doesn't. We can put up her work right now. And what was it, like 2005, maybe 2010 or so, is like all this work. We see it now still about the Black imagination. It's like, Sun Ra was talking about the Black imagination, you know what I mean? Like back in the day. Faith was talking about the Black imagination. Maybe they weren't calling it that, but there's this notion. So I think that her work is going to stand the test of time. And so museums that wish to stand the test of time have to think about notions of relevance. And her work is about storytelling in ways that informs how we view and understand the world. It gives shape and form and character to real events and imagined realities, and also systems of power. And I think that her work gives like visual form to specific stories and meanings that contain a bunch of stuff. And I think that what's really wonderful about our work, while you can bring so much to it, the stories have a certain legibility that become apparent in how the figures are arranged. But also, I don't think people talk about the abstraction associated with some of her stitches and just a lot of the work that she's doing that also ties to that as well. I don't know. I mean, she is, there's some subversive stuff there in those stories that I think have like so many layers to them that I think we have yet to see the level of academic commitment to her work that we should see. So museums have a place for fun coming up.
I 100% agree. I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. And I think we should, we can turn it over to questions for a minute. I just wanted to say also, I think one quilt I think really gets at some of the things you're saying, Sandra, is this one on the very right, which is an image of Matisse's chapel, and it's populated. I think a lot of these works are beautiful and they're playful, but they're also really tough. And this one is filled with all of her relatives who had passed away, during her lifetime and past, including her, both of her parents, her sister, her younger brother, her older brother. And the narrative that, the text on the quilt, which oftentimes people go through and don't actually read the text, though, it's a really tough story about, a relative, an imagined conversation between a relative and, a white man talking about their respective, responsibilities to the memory of slavery and their, and to the actions of their ancestors. And, I think you could go through this whole series and think about it as a really beautiful reflection on museums, but like, that's a really, to put that in, in the space of Matisse's chapel, like this kind of like, temple to aesthetic reflection, I think is really significant. And I think it's, pushing people in ways that I think people might find unexpected and that we still have to really be thinking about now. So, rather than rambling on, I think, we're nearing the end, but maybe I'll look at see if there's any questions in here that might be worth answering. And if you have, want to add a question now, that's sure. Did Faith Ringgold and Jacob Lawrence have a friendship? That's a good question. I think they certainly knew each other. Lawrence was part of the Spiral group, which denied Faith membership, early on in her career, which was, the prominent organization for Black artists, which only had one member. And I think, although she did have, engagements with figures like Lawrence and Bearden, I think she had to make her own space. She joined a gallery that was, which was not devoted exclusively to Black artists, but she, did much work to kind of to create space for the kind of work that she was making and for the, urgency of the kinds of work that she was making that I think changed a lot that happened afterwards. But she certainly knew Lawrence and she certainly knew, all of those living figures. Are there ekphrastic poems inspired by Faith Ringgold's art? I don't know. I don't know if anybody else knows if there are or not, but not that I know of. But do you think there's something about the physicality of making a quilt that motivated Miss Ringgold? I think that's certainly true. As I mentioned before, the first quilt she makes is with her mother, who had been a fashion designer in Harlem and, had shows and things like that. Prior to that, in the 1970s, she'd been making, dolls and masks, and also had been making these kind of hanging tapestry-like works inspired by Tibetan tankas. And as I mentioned before, that decision was an aesthetic decision, an acknowledgement of these, skills that had been, traditionally, pushed to the side in, the realm of contemporary art, but also a practical decision in that, she was able to, she didn't have to, stretch the canvases herself. It was easy to kind of move them up down the stairs. And, that was a decision to create an autonomy for herself and, without having for her to rely on, a husband or a gallerist or an institution, and allowed her to make work in without having to destroy old work, which I think is something significant that is not talked about a lot. There's a lot of work in the show that we have at the new museum, but Faith made even, she could have filled another entire museum with equally incredible work that we don't have in the show. And I think we're all really, really lucky that she made a decision to make work that can stand the test of time and be stored. And, it just increased the amount of stories that she could tell, which I think is really important. So I think that might've been the end of the questions from the audience.
I think I just want to chime in here to say that we didn't talk about like some of her other contemporaries, like Klaus Oldenburg, and how like the level of acceptance he saw, making soft sculptures that she didn't see, making material culture in a different way. It's just so interesting to think about kind of how, I mean, even just flipping through these images, I haven't seen the show yet, just like the range of materials she used to produce work, painting, sculpture, quilts, all of that, books, just so much. And she kind of gets talked about in the form of just some quilts, I mean, in that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a super important point. I also want to bring it up again, just that, the quilts are incredible. They're the formal decisions she makes are incredibly bold and experimental and really critically engaged with what was happening in the world at the time. So the flag is bleeding from 1967. She said that's she had been thinking about Johns's flag, and of course they're the same age. But for her, Johns's flag didn't go far enough. It didn't say enough about America, and she needed to do something that was more responsive to the the necessity for what art should be doing at that time. Die here, we talked about Die, it's a shocking image. It's a document of that moment in time, but it's, a response to mural scale painting being made by male artists at the time that, again, had nothing to say about what was happening in the country. So she looks back to Guernica, she looks to Picasso, and, she comes up with something that, says more about that moment than almost anything else made at that, during that entire decade. So, that face importance to that era, and the fact that she may have been doing it in Harlem to a limited audience, doesn't necessarily speak to the kind of reverberations that work would make throughout art, and I think throughout American culture. So one last question, I think. What is the most important work not to miss in this exhibit? I will see it Wednesday. And has she and Bisa Butler collaborated? That I don't know. And I can't narrow it down to one work. I think everybody has their own favorite work by Quilt. I love Sunny's quilt. I love the Street Story quilt. I think this room of work that you're seeing right now, which is her show from 1967 of these 3 mural paintings, and then the following show from 1970 of her blacklight paintings, where she tries to eliminate white as a constituent color of her paintings entirely, to create a language that is, a language for painting that is, appropriate for representing Black bodies. I think is, truly radical, and is as radical today. So I think this room, is, any artist would be, more than proud to have this, stand in for their whole career. But there's so much in the show. And then, was she involved in the installation of creation of the show? Faith was not involved in the installation. She came at the end. Faith still spends, time working on work, and she has, works that are still under production and things that are coming out soon. Like many artists, I think she's happy to make the work, and was kind enough to let us kind of take the reins here. And anyway, I think that's basically it. I think we've kept you guys long enough, but I want to thank you to Sandra, to Sharifa, to Nari, to Rob, and to everybody who has joined us here tonight. And like I said, please come join the show, come see the show in person. Please check out the catalog, and thank you, and stay safe, and have a good night.